What's the connection between this film, The Magnificent Seven, and communicative language teaching? Well, to be perfectly honest, not much. But if you're interested in the very tenuous link that I'm drawing here, keep watching. If this is the first time we're meeting, I'm Joga Conga. I've been teaching since 1989 and training teachers on CLT and MA TESOL programs for over 20 years now. I've also got a website at elttraining.com where I make video-based material for teachers at all stages of their careers. Check it out and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more of my stuff. So, communicative language teaching. You've probably heard this term and you've probably guessed that it's about teaching language by communicating. But if that's as far as your knowledge goes, then listen up and I'll give you 7 of the most fundamental ideas behind this, and you can see how you think your teaching matches up. 7, you see? Magnificent 7. I told you it was a tenuous link, but I think I've got some useful points here. Are you ready? This is going to be a bit longer than my usual videos, so get yourself a beverage of your choice perhaps. Make yourself comfortable and we'll begin. Before we get going, it's probably a good idea to think about what communicative language teaching, or CLT, isn't, and it's usually compared to the grammar translation method, GTM if you like. The clue here is in the name, and it relies heavily on translation into and out of the target language. That's the one you're learning, also called L2, from L1, that's the one you already speak. So grammar translation tends to focus on learning word lists and grammatical syntax by rote, doing a lot of controlled gap fill type of exercises, and it usually prioritises writing. That's how I learned, or didn't learn actually, French and Spanish in school. And if you learned a language in a large class in school, this is probably going to seem quite familiar to you. The idea of grammar translation has kind of fallen out of fashion, really, and it's often held up as a sort of a straw man against CLT methodology. You know what I mean? We used to do this, but now we're enlightened and we don't. In honesty, this kind of methodology is fine if what you want to do is pass exams in the target language. It's not so great if you actually want to communicate. Now, you might think that this is just laughable, and to a large extent I would agree, but it's worth bearing in mind that for a lot of people, especially teenagers in school, that passing exams motivation is still a very strong one. It's really important. So stop me for a minute and think about a language that you've learnt. What was your motivation and how were you taught? Go on, just stop me for a minute. Okay, so that's a bit of background and what CLT isn't. Then what is it? Grammar translation as a methodology started to go out of fashion in the 1970s, and it was replaced in lots of contexts by other methods that moved towards more of an emphasis on speaking and using the language in a more natural way. You'll often hear this change towards more communicative methodology described as a rather linear one. We start with grammar translation, we move on to audiolingualism, and then the direct method, and that leads on to various methods that come under the CLT umbrella. Alternative approaches such as the silent way, Suggestopedia, community language learning, and then onto task-based learning and the lexical approach, and now into a world where we are post-method. according to some pretty eminent scholars. In fact, though, it's much more complex than this, as most things often are. And some of those methods have been locally adopted in some places and at some times, but not in others. For the sake of this video, though, I'm trying to keep it simple here. The important thing to keep in mind is that some form of CLT has been the dominant approach in English language teaching since the 1980s. If you look at the aims of most government education systems and the big publishing houses worldwide, you know who they are, they'll usually say that this is their goal, what they're aiming for. Well, you're probably still thinking, what is it? Let's have a definition from Diane Larson-Freeman. She says that CLT aims to enable learners to communicate in the target language, and learners use the target language a great deal through communicative activities such as language games, role play and problem-solving tasks. So we have two main issues here, I think. There's a focus on extensive use of the target language in a meaningful context. So let's unpack these a bit. Extensive use. So the idea is that the learners are using the language, not just learning about it. It also means that speaking is in the forefront, although it doesn't mean that writing is off the agenda completely. And a meaningful context, this means language that you might actually need. So sentences like, "This is my head," and gap fill exercises where you need to fill in the past tense of the verb in decontextualised sentences, those are out. And the kind of activities that are used or are more preferable are ones where there's a purpose for the talk, a task that you have to achieve, using the language in the way that you use your first language. So what does that mean for us as language teachers? It's a big question, but I've put together, finally we're getting there, to my magnificent 7, the things that I think are the important takeaways of CLT. It isn't a definitive list, of course, but it's my list, and I hope it's helpful to you. Saddle up, we're off. Number 1, more student talk, less teacher lecture. This is the big one, and it's often the one that trainee and novice and experienced teachers struggle with. So if you want them to learn to use the language, they have to be using it, not you. The secret here, and it's not rocket science frankly, is to plan for learner activity. Aim to replace a long teacher at the board lecture, an explanation, with pair work or group work. If you want them to use the language, give them the opportunity to do it and give them a task and a purpose. Number 2, personalisation. Relevant, interesting topics. The next thing is that if you're going to get them using the language, you better make sure that they're interested in the topics that you're talking about. One of the best things about teaching language, I think, is that it's skills-based. So the content can be whatever you or your learners find interesting. Use this idea and keep in mind that the easiest thing to talk about is yourself. Number 3, contextualised language. It's easier to understand language when it's in a clear and obvious context, not just at the word level or the sentence level. So CLT aims to start from a context such as a reading or a listening text and take the language out of it rather than starting with the language and building to a context. So lessons don't start with, today we're going to study the present perfect. They might start with talking about experiences. Have you ever seen an elephant? Where? What was it like? And then pull the language out of that context. Have you ever seen an elephant? No, I've only seen them on TV. Number 4, authentic language. Although the use of more authentic text isn't necessarily part of CLT, it's come to be an issue that's associated with it. This means that we avoid the kind of conversations that I remember from course books in my early career. I'm sure you know the kind I mean, the ones that sound artificial and obviously designed to showcase grammar. One I particularly remember is, why are you washing your dishes in the bathtub? Do you usually wash your dishes in the bathtub? No, I don't usually wash my dishes in the bathtub, but I'm washing them in the bathtub today because my sink is broken. This is genuinely from a course book I used in the 1980s. I won't say which one, but it's still for sale on Amazon. Using more authentic language means conversations that sound more like natural language, even if they're not genuinely authentic, because they need to be easier. There are debates about what constitutes authentic language and how important this is, or not, and whether any language in a classroom context can be seen to be authentic. But the general principle, I think, is still worth bearing in mind. Number 5, grammar where it's useful. What about grammar? As we saw before, the grammar translation method was big on that. The grammar was taught almost as an academic exercise in its own right, and this is often called a focus on form. The teacher comes into the class and says, today we're going to learn the present continuous. CLT is a bit different. Now grammar, at least in theory, is taught as it's needed by the learners. So the purpose of the language comes first. So if you were getting the learners to describe a holiday that they'd been on, they'd need past tenses. And we teach them in the context of holidays. Confusingly, this is referred to as a focus on forms, just with that S. So in CLT, grammar is more of a passenger and not in the driving seat. But that doesn't mean not teaching grammar. It's still a central part of teaching. And in honesty, I think it's what learners expect. But the CLT approach would tend to have more focus on the learner's communicative competence. Can they communicate effectively? Rather than grammatical competence. Is their language always accurate? In practice, this means that there's more time spent on more commonly used forms that learners need for communication. So we need to spend more time on the past simple because it's hugely common and useful, and not so much time on the present perfect passive, which is rather rare. It also means that although there's a place for controlled practice like gap fills to make sure that learners know the correct form of the language, we want to put more emphasis on using the grammar in a contextualised way, such as in a discussion or an information gap or a role play. This is actually much harder, and it's why so much freer practice is important. Number 6, the importance of lexis and chunks of language. Number 6 on my list is lexis. Now, it's arguable that this is Michael Lewis's lexical approach rather than CLT that's brought the focus back to vocabulary and to teaching learners chunks of language and collocations, words that go together. But in either case, I think it's worth including in this list. A communicative approach tends to emphasise the importance of words, and especially to teaching multi-word chunks to help learners sound more fluent. So for example, don't teach insist, teach insist on doing something. And number 7, functional approach. Finally, and probably linked to teaching grammar and contextualised form and teaching lexis in multi-word chunks, using a functional approach has become associated with CLT. So this means teaching the kind of language and phrases that you might need in a particular situation for a particular purpose. For example, the kind of conversation that might happen in a shop. Can I help you? Have you got this in a bigger size? Or the kind of language that you might need to make suggestions. You could, have you thought about, if I were you, I'd... At lower levels, you might not even want to analyse these functional exponents. They don't need to know the second conditional to understand that if I were you, I'd is advice. Means that I think it's a good idea. Okay, so 7 things, my magnificent 7. I'm going to put them back up on the screen and I want you to pause me and try to remember what I said about each one. If you can't, feel free to rewind. Have you got all of that? Great. I hope that this is useful to keep in mind when you're planning your lessons and when you're teaching. Have fun with it. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.